The moment I opened that certified letter from First National Bank and saw the words, "Fraudulent activity detected on your pension account," was the moment I realized my own son had been stealing from me for over 2 years. Arthur Bell, the boy I'd raised alone after his father walked out, had been intercepting my monthly pension checks and depositing them into his own account, while telling me the payments were simply delayed due to government processing issues. For 28 months, I'd been rationing groceries and skipping medications because I believed my $2,400 monthly pension was stuck in bureaucratic red tape. Meanwhile, Arthur was using my money to fund his gambling addiction and expensive lifestyle, all while visiting me weekly with concerned looks and promises that he was looking into the delay for me. What he didn't know was that the bank's fraud detection system had finally caught his scheme, and that letter would set in motion a chain of events that would expose not just his theft, but a web of lies that had been destroying my life while I trusted him completely. This is the story of how I discovered my son's betrayal and what I did next that changed both of our lives forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The moment I opened that certified letter from First National Bank and saw the words "fraudulent activity detected on your pension account" was the moment I realized my own son had been stealing from me for over 2 years. My hands trembled as I read the official notice, each word hitting me like a physical blow. Arthur Bell, my only son, the boy I'd sacrificed everything for after his father abandoned us when he was just 12, had been systematically intercepting my monthly pension deposits and funneling them into his personal accounts. I had to read the letter 3 times before the full scope of his betrayal sank in. According to the bank's investigation, someone had been using forged documents and my personal information to redirect my $2,400 monthly pension payments to an account I'd never authorized. The fraudulent activity had been ongoing for 28 months, totaling $67,200 in stolen funds. 28 months during which I'd been surviving on crackers and canned soup, skipping my blood pressure medications, and wearing the same 3 sweaters through 2 brutal Ohio winters because I believed my pension payments were simply caught up in government bureaucracy. My name is Ruby Bennett, and at 74 years old, I thought I'd seen every kind of heartbreak life could deliver. I'd survived my husband Harold walking out when Arthur was in middle school, claiming he never wanted the responsibility of a family. I'd worked double shifts at the textile factory for 15 years to keep food on the table, and Arthur in decent clothes for school. I'd sat alone at his high school graduation, college graduation, and wedding, proud but aching that Harold had missed watching his son become a man. Through it all, Arthur had been my anchor, my proof that all those years of struggle had been worth something. He'd grown into a seemingly responsible adult with a good job at Morrison Insurance Company, a nice house in the suburbs of Cleveland, and a wife named Violet, who worked as a dental hygienist. They'd given me 2 beautiful grandchildren, 8-year-old Jasper and 5-year-old Iris, who called me Grandma Ruby and filled my small apartment with laughter during their weekend visits. Or so I had believed. Sitting in my threadbare armchair, with that letter in my shaking hands, I began to piece together the elaborate deception Arthur had been orchestrating. Every month for over 2 years, when I'd called him worried about my missing pension check, he'd had a ready explanation. "Government budget issues, Mom. You know how slow they are with paperwork. There's a backlog because of the new computer system. I talked to someone at the pension office today, and they said it should be resolved within the next few weeks." I remembered how concerned he'd seemed during those conversations, how he'd even offered to look into it for me, promising to make calls and follow up with the right departments. What a fool I'd been, trusting his every word while he was robbing me blind. He'd even gone so far as to bring me small amounts of cash during his visits, $20 or $40 at a time, claiming it was just something to help until your check comes through. I'd been so grateful for his generosity, so touched that my successful son was taking care of his struggling mother. The cruelest part was watching me ration my groceries and worry aloud about paying my utilities while he sat at my kitchen table, eating the meager meals I could afford, nodding sympathetically as I fretted about making ends meet. He'd witnessed me diluting my dish soap to make it last longer, seen me wearing 2 pairs of socks because I couldn't afford to heat my apartment properly, and listened to me apologize for not being able to buy better Christmas presents for Jasper and Iris. "Don't worry about it, Mom," he'd say with what I now realized was feigned compassion. "The kids understand that Grandma's going through a tough time right now. Your pension situation will get sorted out soon." Meanwhile, according to the bank's records, he'd been using my stolen pension money to maintain his comfortable lifestyle. The investigation had traced deposits to his personal account that coincided exactly with my missing pension payments. While I was choosing between groceries and medication, he was apparently living without financial stress, taking family vacations, and maintaining the suburban lifestyle that his insurance job alone wouldn't have supported. The letter explained that First National Bank's fraud detection algorithms had flagged the suspicious activity when they noticed that pension deposits intended for one account were consistently being rerouted to another account with a different Social Security number. The bank had launched an investigation and discovered forged documentation that had been used to establish the fraudulent redirects. They were now freezing all related accounts and launching a formal investigation that would likely involve law enforcement. As I sat there in my dimly lit apartment, surrounded by the evidence of my financial desperation, the stack of unpaid bills on my coffee table, the empty refrigerator humming in the corner, the space heater I used because I couldn't afford proper heating, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just betrayal, but a complete reorientation of reality. Everything I'd believed about my son, about our relationship, about the past 2 years of my life, had been a lie. The boy I'd raised to be honest and compassionate had been stealing from me while watching me suffer. The son who'd hugged me goodbye after each visit, promising to keep checking on that pension situation, had been the very person causing my financial hardship. The man I'd trusted with my spare house key, my medical information, and my deepest worries about aging alone had been systematically robbing me of the security I'd worked 43 years to earn. I thought about all those nights I'd lain awake, worrying about money, calculating and recalculating how to stretch my small savings until my pension payments resumed. I remembered the embarrassment of having to ask my neighbor, Daisy Clark, if I could borrow milk or bread until my check came in. I recalled the shame of having to decline lunch invitations with my few remaining friends because I couldn't afford a restaurant meal, all of it unnecessary, all of it orchestrated by the person I loved and trusted most in the world. The letter concluded with instructions to contact Detective George Holmes at the Cleveland Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit and to schedule an appointment with the bank's fraud department to begin the process of recovering the stolen funds. As I reached for my phone to make the first call, my hands were no longer trembling with shock, but steady, with a resolve I hadn't felt in decades. Arthur Bell was about to learn that the mother he'd been stealing from was far from the helpless victim he'd apparently believed her to be. My name is Ruby Bennett, and if you'd told me a year ago that I'd be sitting in a police station filing fraud charges against my own son, I would have laughed at the impossibility of it. At 74, I'd always prided myself on being a good judge of character, a skill I'd developed through decades of necessity as a single mother navigating life's challenges alone. I was born Ruby Mae Patterson in 1949 in the small town of Millbrook, Ohio, the youngest of 4 daughters to parents who ran a modest dairy farm. My father, Walter Patterson, taught me early that hard work was the only currency that mattered, and my mother, Alice, showed me that a woman could be both gentle and fiercely independent. Those lessons would serve me well in the years to come, though I couldn't have imagined how much I'd need them. I met Harold Bell when I was 22, working as a seamstress at Patterson Textiles, the town's largest employer. Harold was handsome, charming, and full of big dreams about opening his own auto repair shop. He courted me with flowers picked from other people's gardens and promises of a life filled with adventure and prosperity. We married in 1972 in a simple ceremony at Millbrook Methodist Church, with my sisters as bridesmaids and Harold's brother Oscar as best man. For the first few years, our marriage felt like everything I dreamed of. Harold was attentive, ambitious, and seemed genuinely excited about building a life together. We rented a small house on Maple Street, and I continued working at the textile factory while Harold took a job at Williams Auto Repair, learning the trade and saving money for his own shop. We talked about having babies, about buying a house with a big backyard, about growing old together on the front porch swing. Arthur came along in 1974, and I thought our little family was complete. He was a beautiful baby with Harold's dark hair and my green eyes, and I threw myself into motherhood with the same determination I'd applied to everything else in my life. I took a leave from the factory for 6 months, treasuring every moment with my son, marveling at his first smiles, his first words, the way he'd grab my finger with his tiny fist as if he never wanted to let me go. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But parenthood changed Harold in ways I hadn't anticipated. The reality of supporting a family seemed to weigh on him heavily, and his dreams of owning his own business began to feel more like burdens than aspirations. He started working longer hours, staying out later with friends, and becoming increasingly distant from both Arthur and me. When Arthur was learning to walk, Harold was rarely home to witness the milestones. When our son said his first words, Harold was at Murphy's Tavern, drowning his frustrations in beer and complaints about responsibility. I tried to bridge the growing gap between them, encouraging Harold to spend time with Arthur, planning family, activities that might rekindle his interest in being a father. But Harold seemed to view his son as an obligation rather than a joy, and his resentment grew with each passing month. He began talking about feeling trapped, about how he'd never wanted the responsibility of a family, about how his dreams were being suffocated by mortgage payments and diaper expenses. The breaking point came when Arthur was 12. I'd been working double shifts at the textile factory to help Harold save for his auto repair shop, coming home exhausted, but still trying to maintain our household and be present for Arthur's school events. Harold had finally accumulated enough money to lease a small garage space, and I thought this achievement might revive his enthusiasm for our family life. Instead, it seemed to crystallize his desire to escape. One Tuesday morning in March 1986, I woke up to find a note on the kitchen table. Harold had cleaned out our joint savings account and left town, heading to Florida with a woman named Cora Davies, who worked at the bank where we'd been saving for his business. The note was brief and brutal. "I never wanted this life. You and the boy will be better off without me." Arthur found me crying at the kitchen table when he came down for breakfast. At 12, he was old enough to understand that his father had abandoned us, old enough to see the financial devastation Harold's departure had caused, old enough to witness his mother's heartbreak and confusion. But he was also young enough to somehow blame himself, to wonder what he'd done wrong to make his father leave. "Did Dad leave because of me?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "No, sweetheart," I told him, pulling him close. "Your father left because he couldn't handle being responsible for other people. That's about his character, not about anything you did or didn't do." I meant those words, and I spent the next several years proving them to Arthur through my actions. I took on additional shifts at the factory, working 60-hour weeks to keep our small house and ensure Arthur had everything he needed for school. I attended every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every soccer game, often arriving directly from work with grease still under my fingernails from the textile machinery. Money was always tight, but I was determined that Arthur wouldn't suffer for his father's selfishness. I shopped at thrift stores for my clothes, but bought Arthur new shoes when he needed them. I ate peanut butter sandwiches for lunch to save money for his school supplies. I worked overtime during Christmas season to ensure he had presents under the tree, even if I had to wrap them in newspaper because I couldn't afford proper wrapping paper. Arthur seemed to thrive despite the challenges. He was a bright student who never gave me trouble, respectful to teachers and neighbors, helpful, around the house without being asked. He seemed to understand intuitively that we were a team now, that we needed to look out for each other. When I came home exhausted from work, he'd often have dinner started or homework already completed. When I worried aloud about bills, he'd reassure me that we'd figure it out together. "You and me against the world, Mom," he'd say with a maturity that sometimes broke my heart. I was so proud when he graduated valedictorian from Millbrook High School, earning a partial scholarship to Ohio State University. I worked extra shifts to cover the remaining tuition costs, driving my 15-year-old Ford until it finally died, then taking the bus to work for 2 years rather than financing a car payment that might interfere with Arthur's education. When he graduated with a degree in business administration and landed a good job at Morrison Insurance Company in Cleveland, I felt like every sacrifice had been worthwhile. My son had beaten the odds, had overcome his father's abandonment to become a successful, responsible man. When he married Violet Ward, a sweet girl from a good family, and they bought a house in the suburbs, I was bursting with pride. The grandchildren came next, Jasper in 2015 and Iris in 2018, and suddenly my life felt rich in ways I'd never imagined possible. Arthur would bring them to visit every other weekend, and those little voices calling Grandma Ruby were like music to my soul. I'd retired from the textile factory at 67 with a modest pension that, combined with Social Security, allowed me to live simply but comfortably in my small apartment. For the first time in decades, I felt secure, surrounded by family, confident that all those years of struggle had produced something beautiful and lasting. Arthur was a devoted son who called regularly, visited often, and seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being as I aged. Or so I had believed, until that letter from First National Bank shattered every assumption I'd held about the man I'd raised and the family I thought we'd built together. The 3 years leading up to that devastating bank letter were what I had imagined would be the peaceful chapter of my life. After 43 years of working at Patterson Textiles, dealing with the deafening noise of industrial looms and the constant pressure of production quotas, retirement felt like stepping into a quiet sanctuary I'd earned through decades of dedication and sacrifice. My small 2-bedroom apartment on Thornwood Avenue in Cleveland's West Side neighborhood wasn't much to look at from the outside, but it was mine. The building was a converted 1920s house with thick walls that kept out the city noise, and my second-floor unit had large windows that let in beautiful morning light. I'd furnished it simply but comfortably with pieces collected over the years. My grandmother's oak dining table, a floral sofa I'd bought on sale at Sears, and Harold's old leather recliner that somehow I'd never had the heart to throw away, despite everything. The best part of my apartment was the small sunroom where I'd set up what Arthur laughingly called my command center, a desk where I paid bills, wrote letters to my sisters who'd scattered across the country, and kept meticulous records of my finances in the same green ledger book I'd been using for 20 years. Organization had always been my way of maintaining control in an unpredictable world, and retirement gave me the luxury of time to keep everything perfectly in order. My daily routine was simple but satisfying. I'd wake up at 6:30, make coffee in the same percolator I'd used since 1978, and sit at my kitchen table reading the Cleveland Plain Dealer while listening to the morning news on my small radio. The local news anchor, Frederick Scott, had a voice that reminded me of my father, steady and reassuring. And starting my day with his familiar commentary made me feel connected to the larger world, even in my quiet apartment. After breakfast, I'd take a walk through the neighborhood if the weather was decent. The West Side had changed significantly since I'd moved there, with young families buying the old houses and fixing them up, planting gardens, and adding playground equipment to their backyards. I enjoyed watching the children wait for school, Buses, their backpacks bigger than they were, their voices bright with excitement about the day ahead. It reminded me of Arthur at that age, when life was full of possibilities and every day brought new discoveries. Grocery shopping was an event I actually looked forward to, methodically working my way through Schneider's Market with a carefully planned list and envelope of cash. My pension check of $2,400 arrived like clockwork on the 3rd of every month, and combined with my Social Security payment, it allowed me to live comfortably without dipping into the small savings account I kept for emergencies. I could afford fresh vegetables, decent cuts of meat, and even the occasional luxury like ice cream or bakery cookies for when the grandchildren visited. Those weekend visits from Arthur's family were the highlights of my month. Every other Saturday, I'd hear Jasper and Iris thundering up the stairs to my apartment, their voices echoing in the hallway as they argued about who would ring my doorbell first. 8-year-old Jasper was serious and thoughtful like his father had been at that age, always bringing me drawings he'd made at school or books he wanted to read together. 5-year-old Iris was pure energy and sunshine, climbing onto my lap for stories and insisting on helping me bake cookies, even though her help usually meant more flour on the floor than in the bowl. Arthur and Violet seemed genuinely happy during those visits. Arthur would sit at my kitchen table drinking coffee and telling me about his work at Morrison Insurance Company, where he'd recently been promoted to senior claims adjuster. He was proud of his success, and I was proud of him, this man who'd overcome his father's abandonment to build a stable, prosperous life for his own family. Violet would often bring her knitting and sit with me on the sofa, sharing gentle gossip about their neighbors and asking my advice about everything from potty training Iris to dealing with Jasper's stubborn streak. "You raised such a good man," Violet would tell me, watching Arthur help Jasper with homework at the dining table. "He talks about you all the time, about how hard you worked to give him opportunities. He says everything good in his life started with your example." Those words meant everything to me. After Harold's abandonment, I'd worried constantly that Arthur would grow up angry or damaged, that a boy needed his father in ways I couldn't provide. But watching him with his own children, seeing the patience and love he showed them, I felt vindicated in all those choices I'd made as a struggling single mother. Our family dinners were simple but warm. I'd cook Arthur's favorites, pot roast with carrots and potatoes, or my famous chicken and dumplings that took all afternoon to prepare properly. We'd eat around my grandmother's table, the children chattering about school and friends while Arthur and Violet caught me up on their lives. After dinner, Arthur would insist on doing the dishes while I read stories to Jasper and Iris, their small bodies curled against me on the sofa as we worked our way through books about brave princesses and talking animals. When it was time for them to leave, the children would hug me tightly, promising to be good until the next visit. Arthur would always linger at the door, asking if I needed anything from the store, if my apartment was warm enough, if I was feeling okay. He seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being, always offering to help with errands or household tasks. "You sure you're doing all right, Mom?" he'd ask, studying my face with what seemed like genuine worry. "You're eating enough? Not having any problems with bills or anything?" I'd reassure him that I was fine, that my pension and Social Security were covering everything I needed. "You raised me to be self-sufficient," I'd tell him with a smile. I learned from the best. Between family visits, I filled my time with activities I'd never had time for during my working years. I joined the book club at Millbrook Public Library, where a group of 8 women met monthly to discuss everything from romance novels to historical biographies. I started volunteering at the local food pantry 2 mornings a week, sorting donations and helping families choose groceries, work that felt meaningful and reminded me how fortunate I was to have my pension and Social Security as a safety net. I also began what I jokingly called my correspondence career, writing long letters to my 3 sisters who'd moved away over the years. Madeline lived in Phoenix with her husband Bruce, and we exchanged weekly letters full of family news and memories of our childhood on the farm. Eliza had settled in Portland after her divorce, and her letters were filled with adventures from her job at a nonprofit organization. Amara had moved to Florida after retiring from teaching, and her letters usually included photographs of her garden and the wild birds that visited her backyard feeder. These connections, the family visits, the book club discussions, the volunteer work, the letters from my sisters, created a web of relationships that made retirement feel rich and purposeful rather than lonely or empty. I had enough money to live comfortably, enough activities to keep my mind engaged, and enough family contact to feel loved and valued. My small apartment felt like a sanctuary where I could finally rest after decades of struggle, surrounded by photographs of the grandchildren, letters from my sisters, and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. I went to sleep each night grateful for the peace I'd found, confident in the financial security my pension provided, and optimistic about the years ahead. I had no idea that the foundation of security I'd built so carefully was already crumbling beneath me, undermined by the very person I trusted most in the world. The first sign that something had shifted in my carefully ordered world came on March 5th, 2021, when my pension check didn't arrive. For 43 years of working at Patterson Textiles, that check had appeared in my mailbox like clockwork on the 3rd of every month, as reliable as sunrise. I'd built my entire retirement budget around that predictability, planning my grocery shopping, bill payments, and small luxuries around that monthly deposit of security. When the mailbox remained empty on the 5th, I felt only mild concern. Mail delivery had become increasingly unreliable during the pandemic, and I'd heard other residents in my building complaining about delayed Social Security checks and utility bills arriving weeks late. I marked my calendar to call the pension office if the check hadn't arrived by March 8th, then went about my normal routine, confident it was just a temporary glitch in an otherwise dependable system. March 8th came and went. So did March 10th. By March 12th, that mild concern had blossomed into genuine worry. I called the pension office at Patterson Textiles, now owned by a larger corporation called Midwest Manufacturing, and spent 23 minutes on hold listening to tinny classical music before reaching a harried-sounding woman named Phoebe Hayes in the benefits department. "Mrs. Bennett," she said after pulling up my file, "I show that your pension payment was processed and sent on March 1st, just like always. If you haven't received it by now, you should probably contact your bank to see if there was a deposit issue." This puzzled me more than it worried me. I'd been receiving my pension by direct deposit for over 6 years, and there had never been a single problem. I called First National Bank and spoke with a customer service representative who confirmed that no deposit had been made to my account in March. When I explained the situation, she suggested that I ask the pension office to provide a trace number for the deposit so the bank could investigate where the money had gone. This began what would become a monthly ritual of confusion and frustration that lasted for over 2 years. Each month, the pension office would insist they'd sent my payment. Each month, my bank would confirm that no payment had been received. Each month, both sides would suggest that the other institution was somehow at fault, leaving me caught in the middle with bills to pay and a rapidly dwindling savings account. What made this situation bearable, even manageable, was Arthur's immediate and seemingly genuine concern when I called to tell him about the missing pension check. I'd hesitated to bother him with my problems, knowing how busy he was with work and his young family, but I was scared and didn't know where else to turn. "That's terrible, Mom," he said, his voice filled with the same protective tone he'd used as a teenager when kids at school had teased me about my secondhand clothes. "Corporate bureaucracy at its worst. But don't worry, I'll help you figure this out. My company deals with pension providers all the time. I know how these systems work." Arthur took charge with the kind of decisive competence that made me proud of the man he'd become. He asked me to forward him all the correspondence from both the pension office and the bank, promising to make calls and cut through the red tape that was apparently preventing my payment from reaching my account. Within a week, he called back. with what seemed like a reasonable explanation. "I talked to someone at Midwest Manufacturing," he reported, "and apparently they've been having major problems with their new computer system. The guy I spoke with said dozens of retirees have been affected, and they're working around the clock to fix the glitches. He said your payment is safe. It's just caught up in their system upgrade." This explanation made perfect sense to me. I'd lived through enough corporate transitions at Patterson Textiles to know how disruptive new technology could be, especially when it came to payroll and benefits. When Arthur offered to keep calling and checking on the status of my payment, I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for his willingness to advocate for me. "You don't have to do this," I told him. "I know you're busy with your own life." "Mom, you took care of me for 18 years without any help from Dad," he replied firmly. "The least I can do is make some phone calls to get your pension sorted out. Besides, it's what family does for each other, to help me through what he assured me would be a temporary crisis." Arthur began bringing me cash during his weekend visits with the children. The first time, he pressed two $20 bills into my hand as they were leaving, his expression concerned and slightly embarrassed. "Just a little something to help with groceries until your pension gets straightened out," he said. "I hate thinking about you worrying about money when this whole mess isn't even your fault," I protested, but Arthur insisted. "It's not charity, Mom. It's family helping family. When your pension starts coming again, you can pay me back if it makes you feel better. But right now, let me help." His generosity touched me deeply. Here was my son, with a mortgage and 2 small children to support, voluntarily sharing his resources to help his mother through a difficult time. It reinforced everything I'd believed about the man I'd raised, that he was kind, responsible, and committed to taking care of the people he loved. As the months passed and the pension situation remained unresolved, Arthur's financial help became a regular part of our routine. Sometimes he'd bring $40, sometimes $60, always with the same explanation that it was just temporary assistance until the bureaucratic mess got sorted out. He never made me feel like a burden or acted like his help was anything more than what any good son would do for his mother. "Any word from the pension people this week?" he'd ask during our Sunday phone calls, his voice always carrying notes of frustration on my behalf. "I'm going to try calling them again tomorrow. This is getting ridiculous. There has to be someone with authority who can fix this." Arthur's regular updates on his efforts to resolve my pension situation became a source of comfort during increasingly stressful months. He'd tell me about conversations with supervisors at Midwest Manufacturing, meetings with bank officials, and research he was doing into pension law and beneficiary rights. He seemed as frustrated as I was by the slow pace of progress, often apologizing for not being able to fix things faster. "I'm sorry this is taking so long, Mom," he'd say after delivering another disappointing update. "These bureaucrats are impossible to deal with, but I'm not giving up. Your pension is money you earned fair and square, and I'm going to keep pushing until they make this right." What struck me most during this period was how the crisis seemed to bring Arthur and me closer together. He called more frequently, visited more often, and seemed genuinely invested in solving my problem. When I thanked him for all his help, he'd wave off my gratitude with the same gesture he'd used as a boy when I praised him for good grades or helpful behavior around the house. "You'd do the same for me," he'd say simply. Actually, you did do the same for me, for years and years when I was growing up. This is just me returning the favor. I went to sleep most nights during this period feeling frustrated about my missing pension, but grateful for my son's support. Whatever bureaucratic nightmare was preventing my payments from reaching me, at least I wasn't facing it alone. Arthur was fighting for me, using his business knowledge and insurance industry connections to navigate systems that seemed impossibly complex to someone of my generation. The missing pension was a serious problem, but it felt manageable with Arthur's help. I had no idea that the very person I was counting on to solve my crisis was actually the one who had created it, or that his concerned phone calls and helpful visits were part of an elaborate performance designed to cover up the systematic theft of my retirement income. The catalyst for everything that would follow had already been set in motion. I just didn't know it yet. As my pension crisis stretched from weeks into months, I began to notice subtle changes in Arthur's behavior that, while individually insignificant, collectively created a growing sense of unease I couldn't quite articulate. Looking back now, I realize these were warning signs that something far more sinister was happening beneath the surface of his apparent concern and helpfulness. The first thing that struck me as odd was how remarkably well-informed Arthur seemed to be about the specifics of my pension situation. When I'd mentioned calling the pension office myself to check on progress, he'd quickly discourage me with detailed explanations about why that would be counterproductive. "Mom, I've already established a relationship with the supervisor handling your case," he'd say with authority that seemed impressive at the time. "If you call independently, it might confuse their system or duplicate efforts. These corporate bureaucrats hate dealing with multiple contacts for the same issue. Let me handle the communications. That way we can present a unified front." His explanations always sounded reasonable, even professional, drawing on what I assumed was his expertise from working in the insurance industry. But there was something about the way he spoke that felt rehearsed, as if he'd prepared these responses in advance, rather than developing them organically through actual conversations with pension officials. What bothered me more was how Arthur seemed to know things about my financial situation that I hadn't shared with him. During one visit in July 2021, he mentioned that I should be careful about overdraft fees on my checking account, even though I'd never told him I was having trouble maintaining my balance. When I asked how he knew I was concerned about overdrafts, he brushed off my question with a casual explanation about assuming that anyone dealing with delayed pension payments would naturally be worried about their account balances. "It's just common sense, Mom," he said with a slightly impatient tone I'd never heard from him before. When you're not getting your expected income, account management becomes tricky. I was just trying to be helpful. Another red flag appeared. In Arthur's increasing interest in my other financial accounts and assets, he began asking questions about my savings balance, whether I had any certificates of deposit or bonds, and how much equity I might have in my apartment building. These conversations were always framed as concern for my overall financial security during the pension delay, but they felt invasive in a way that made me uncomfortable. "Have you thought about what you'd do if this pension situation drags on for another year?" he asked, during a particularly unsettling conversation in September. "Do you have enough savings to cover your expenses long term? Maybe we should look at your overall financial picture and see if there are assets you could liquidate if necessary." When I told him I preferred to handle my financial planning privately, Arthur's expression shifted in a way that made my stomach clench. For just a moment, his concerned son demeanor slipped, and I caught a glimpse of something harder underneath. Frustration, perhaps even anger that I wasn't being more cooperative with his inquiries. "I'm just trying to help you plan ahead," he said, his voice carrying an edge of irritation. "If you don't want to share the details of your finances with your own son, fine. But don't come crying to me if you get into serious trouble because you were too proud to accept advice." Comment stung not just because of its harshness, but because it represented a complete reversal of our usual dynamic. Arthur had never spoken to me with such dismissive condescension, and his implication that I was being unreasonably secretive about my finances felt manipulative and unfair. More troubling were the changes in Arthur's behavior around money during our family visits. In the past, he'd always been generous but modest about his financial success, never flaunting his comfortable lifestyle or making me feel embarrassed about my simpler circumstances. But during the period when my pension was supposedly delayed, Arthur began displaying what seemed like increasing prosperity in ways that didn't quite align with his expressions of concern about my financial struggles. In October, he arrived for our usual weekend visit driving a brand new SUV, a gleaming silver vehicle that must have cost more than I'd earned in my last year at the textile factory. When I commented on the beautiful car, Arthur seemed almost defensive about the purchase. "Violet's been wanting something safer for the kids," he explained quickly. "We got a great deal because of my insurance industry connections. Besides, with my recent promotion and bonus, we could afford to upgrade." The explanation made sense, but something about his delivery felt forced. More puzzling was the timing. If Arthur was genuinely concerned about my financial difficulties and spending his own money to help me buy groceries, why was this the moment he chose to purchase an expensive new vehicle? I also noticed that Violet had begun wearing jewelry I'd never seen before: a delicate gold bracelet, diamond stud earrings, and a watch that caught the light in a way that suggested genuine quality rather than costume jewelry. When I complimented her on a particularly beautiful necklace during a December visit, she touched it self-consciously and mumbled something about it being an early Christmas present from Arthur. The children, too, seemed to be acquiring new toys and clothes at a rate that surprised me. Jasper had a tablet computer that he brought to show me games and educational programs, and Iris had begun wearing outfits that looked expensive. The kind of coordinated sets with matching accessories that I'd always admired in store windows, but never been able to afford for Arthur when he was young. "Business has been really good this year," Arthur explained when I mentioned how grown-up Jasper looked in his new clothes. "The insurance industry has been booming, and I've been getting some substantial bonuses. We're finally at a point where we can give the kids some of the things we never had growing up." That last comment bothered me more than I initially understood. Arthur had never complained about his childhood or suggested that he'd felt deprived by our modest circumstances. In fact, he'd often told Violet stories about our creative Christmas celebrations and budget-friendly family adventures with apparent fondness and pride. This new narrative about things we never had felt like a revision of our shared history that diminished the value of the life we'd built together. The most disturbing warning sign was Arthur's changing attitude toward my independence and decision-making capabilities. He began treating me like someone whose judgment couldn't be trusted, whose ability to manage her own affairs was questionable. This shift was subtle but persistent, expressed through small comments and suggestions that gradually undermined my confidence in my own competence. "Are you sure you're taking your medications correctly?" he'd ask, even though I'd been managing my blood pressure prescription successfully for over 5 years. "Maybe we should set up one of those pill organizers to help you keep track." "Mom, you seem confused about the pension timeline," he'd say when I tried to discuss my own conversations with the benefits office. "Let me handle all the communication so we don't send mixed messages or contradictory information." "Have you been forgetting to lock your apartment door?" "I noticed it was unlocked when we arrived last week. You need to be more careful about security, especially living alone." Each individual comment seemed reasonable, even caring. But collectively, they created a narrative in which I was becoming unreliable, forgetful, and incapable of managing my own life effectively. Arthur was positioning himself not just as my helpful son, but as someone who needed to take increasing responsibility for my welfare because I could no longer be trusted to handle things myself. The most chilling moment came during a January 2022 visit, when Arthur suggested that I might want to consider giving him power of attorney just as a precaution in case my health declined or I became unable to handle my own financial affairs. "It's just a safety net," he explained when I reacted with surprise to the suggestion. "If something happened to you, a fall, a medical emergency, anything that left you temporarily incapacitated, I'd be able to take care of your bills and banking without having to go through a lot of legal complications." When I told him I wasn't comfortable with that level of financial control, Arthur's response was swift and cutting. "Mom, you're 75 years old, and you've been struggling to manage your finances ever since this pension mess started. Maybe it's time to admit that you need help from someone younger and more capable of dealing with complex financial situations." The conversation left me feeling shaken and confused. Was I being unreasonably stubborn about maintaining my independence? Had the stress of the missing pension payments affected my judgment more than I realized? Or was my son, for reasons I couldn't understand, trying to undermine my confidence in my own abilities. I went to bed that night with a growing certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with the situation I found myself in, but I was still far from suspecting that Arthur himself was the source of all my problems. The confrontation that would ultimately expose the truth began on a cold February morning in 2022, nearly 11 months after my pension payments had first gone missing. I was sitting at my kitchen table, surrounded by a growing collection of unpaid bills and bank statements, trying to calculate how much longer I could survive on my dwindling savings when Arthur arrived unannounced at my apartment. This unexpected visit immediately put me on edge. Arthur had always been respectful of my privacy and independence, calling ahead before stopping by and never using the spare key I'd given him except in genuine emergencies. But that Tuesday morning, I heard his key in the lock, followed by his voice calling out, "Mom, it's me. We need to talk." He appeared in my doorway carrying a manila folder thick with documents and wearing an expression I'd never seen before, a mixture of determination and what looked almost like pity. Without waiting for an invitation, he sat down across from me at the kitchen table and opened the folder with the deliberate movements of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "Mom, I've been doing a lot of research about your pension situation," he began, his tone more formal than our usual conversations. "I've talked to financial advisors, looked into pension law, and consulted with some experts at my company. I'm afraid I have some difficult news to share with you." My heart sank. After months of hoping for resolution, I braced myself for whatever devastating update Arthur was about to deliver about my missing payments. "The truth is," Arthur continued, pulling a document from his folder, "your pension situation is much more complicated than we initially understood. Midwest Manufacturing has been having serious financial problems, and there's a real possibility that your pension fund has been compromised." He slid a printed article across the table toward me. The headline read, "Manufacturing Company Faces Federal Investigation for Pension Fund Mismanagement." As I read, Arthur continued his explanation with the kind of detailed knowledge that should have impressed me, but instead triggered a growing sense of alarm. "The company has been using pension fund money to cover operational expenses," he said, his voice carrying notes of barely controlled anger. "They've been making minimum payments to current retirees while essentially robbing the fund that's supposed to support people like you. The government investigation could take years, and in the meantime, thousands of retirees might never see their full benefits." The article was convincing, filled with financial terminology and quotes from pension law experts that seemed to support Arthur's dire assessment. But something about the timing and presentation felt wrong. If this information had been available for months, why was Arthur only sharing it with me now? And how had he obtained such detailed knowledge about investigations that the article suggested were still confidential? "What does this mean for my payments?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Arthur leaned forward, his expression shifting, into what I now recognize was a carefully practiced look of reluctant concern. "Mom, I hate to be the one to tell you this, but your monthly pension payments might be gone forever. Even if the investigation results in some kind of settlement, it could be years before you see any money, and it would probably be a fraction of what you're owed." The news hit me like a physical blow. After working for 43 years, after counting on that pension as the foundation of my retirement security, Arthur was telling me that my financial future had been stolen by corporate criminals who would likely never face meaningful consequences. But then Arthur opened another section of his folder, and his tone shifted from bearer of bad news to concerned son with a solution. "The good news is that I've been planning for this possibility," he said. "I've been researching options for people in your situation, and I think I've found a way to protect you from financial disaster." What he outlined next was a comprehensive plan that he claimed would solve all my problems. He'd been consulting with financial advisors about the best way to help me weather the pension crisis, and they'd recommended that I allow him to take over management of my finances to ensure professional oversight during this difficult period. The experts I've talked to all agree that people in your situation need someone younger and more financially sophisticated to help navigate the complex legal and banking issues involved in pension fund failures, Arthur explained. I'm willing to take on that responsibility. I can manage your savings account, handle your bills, and make sure you have everything you need while we fight to recover your pension money. He pulled out what looked like official bank documents, pointing to sections highlighted in yellow. I've already talked to First National Bank about setting up a joint account that would give me access to help manage your finances. All you need to do is sign these forms, and I can start taking care of everything immediately. The speed and comprehensiveness of Arthur's plan should have reassured me, but instead, it triggered every alarm bell I possessed. This felt less like a son offering help and more like someone who had been planning this conversation for months, preparing detailed solutions to problems I was only just learning about. Arthur, I said carefully, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not comfortable giving you complete control over my finances. I may be 75, but I'm still perfectly capable of managing my own money. His reaction was swift and shocking. The concerned, helpful demeanor dropped away, replaced by an expression of cold frustration that made me feel like I was looking at a stranger. Mom, you're not thinking clearly about this, he said, his voice sharp with impatience. You've been struggling to pay your bills for almost a year. You've been borrowing money from me just to buy groceries. You can barely keep track of which bills you've paid and which ones are overdue. This isn't about your pride. It's about accepting reality. The harshness of his words stung, but what bothered me more was how wrong they were. Yes, I'd been struggling financially since my pension payments stopped, but I'd been managing my reduced circumstances carefully and systematically. I wasn't confused about my bills or borrowing money from Arthur. He'd been giving me cash voluntarily, insisting it was temporary help until my pension situation was resolved. I haven't been borrowing money from you, I said, my own voice rising slightly. You've been offering to help, and I've been grateful for your generosity. But that doesn't mean I'm incapable of managing my own affairs. Arthur's laugh was cold and dismissive. Mom, look around this apartment. Look at those unpaid bills on your table. Look at your bank balance. You're living in denial about how bad things have gotten. The responsible thing, the loving thing, is to let someone who actually understands finance take care of these problems before you end up homeless. That word, homeless, hit me like a slap. Was Arthur really suggesting that I was so incompetent, so financially irresponsible, that I was in danger of losing my apartment? The same apartment I'd been managing successfully for years before my pension payments mysteriously stopped? Arthur, I think you need to leave, I said, standing up from the table. I appreciate your concern, but I'm not signing any documents that give you control over my finances. If and when I need that kind of help, I'll ask for it directly. His response was more threatening than anything he'd said before. Mom, you're making a serious mistake. I'm trying to help you here, but I can't force you to accept help if you're determined to be stubborn about it. Just remember, when things get worse, and they will get worse, I tried to warn you. He gathered his documents and stood to leave, but paused at my kitchen doorway to deliver one final comment that would echo in my mind for weeks afterward. The pension money is gone, Mom. That part isn't negotiable. Your choice is whether you want to let me help you manage what little you have left, or whether you want to struggle alone until you lose everything. But don't pretend this is about your independence. This is about your survival. After he left, I sat at my kitchen table feeling more shaken than I'd been since the day Harold walked out. Something about Arthur's visit felt fundamentally wrong. Not just his pushiness about taking control of my finances, but his entire presentation of the pension situation. The article he'd shown me, the financial advice he claimed to have received, the bank documents he wanted me to sign, all of it felt too convenient, too perfectly aligned with a solution that would give him exactly what he seemed to want. For the first time in nearly a year, I began to wonder if my missing pension payments and Arthur's increasingly controlling behavior might be connected in ways I'd been too trusting to consider. The thought was so devastating that I tried to push it away. But once it had taken root in my mind, I couldn't ignore the growing list of inconsistencies in Arthur's explanations and behavior. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of accepting Arthur's dire predictions about my pension, I was going to do my own investigation into what had really happened to my retirement payments. If my son was telling the truth, my research would confirm his findings. If he wasn't, well, I wasn't ready to consider what that might mean, but I was determined to find out. 3 days after Arthur's threatening visit, I sat in my apartment with a yellow legal pad, a calculator, and every financial document I could find, determined to conduct my own investigation into the pension situation that had been destroying my financial security for almost a year. What I discovered over the next 48 hours would shatter everything I believed about my son and force me to confront the devastating reality that the person I trusted most in the world had been systematically robbing me. My first step was to call the pension office directly, despite Arthur's repeated warnings that I should let him handle all communications. When I reached Phoebe Hayes in the benefits department at Midwest Manufacturing, her response to my inquiry was immediately puzzling. "Mrs. Bennett," she said after looking up my file, "I show that your pension payments have been processing normally every month since your retirement. The last payment was deposited on February 1st, just like always. Are you having problems with your bank?" My heart began racing. "I'm sorry, but that's not correct. I haven't received a pension payment since February 2021. That's why my son Arthur has been calling your office for months trying to resolve the delay." There was a long pause before Phoebe responded, her voice carrying a note of confusion that sent chills down my spine. "Mrs. Bennett, I don't show any record of calls from your son, and according to our system, all your payments have been successfully deposited to account number ending in 7394. Have you been checking the correct account? Account number ending in 7394. My checking account ended in 2816. I'd been banking at First National for over 20 years. I knew my account number by heart. "That's not my account number," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "My account ends in 2816. Another pause, longer this time. "Mrs. Bennett, I think you need to speak with our fraud department. Can you hold while I transfer you?" The next 20 minutes were a blur of transferring between departments, providing identification information, and answering increasingly urgent questions from a fraud investigator named Gerald Fisher. What emerged from that conversation was a picture so horrifying that I initially refused to believe it. According to Gerald's investigation, someone had contacted the pension office in January 2021, claiming to represent me and providing documentation that my pension payments should be redirected to a different account for security purposes. The request had included a notarized letter allegedly signed by me, authorizing the change, along with a copy of a power of attorney document that gave my son Arthur Bell authority to make financial decisions on my behalf. The documentation appeared legitimate, Gerald explained, his voice heavy with regret. "We receive requests like this fairly regularly from elderly beneficiaries who want family members to help manage their finances. Everything was properly notarized and seemed to be in order. But I had never signed a power of attorney. I had never authorized any change to my pension deposit information, and I had certainly never asked Arthur to redirect my payments to his account." "Mr. Fisher," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady, "I never signed any of those documents. I never authorized any changes to my account. Someone has been stealing my pension payments for over a year." The investigation that followed moved with terrifying efficiency. Gerald Fisher connected me with the bank's fraud department, where an investigator named Charles Dixon began tracing the unauthorized account that had been receiving my pension payments. Within hours, they confirmed what I already knew in my heart, but couldn't bring myself to accept. The account belonged to Arthur Bell, my son, Every month for 13 months, my $2,400 pension payment had been deposited directly into Arthur's personal checking account. The total theft amounted to $31,200. Money that I had earned through 4 decades of factory work. Money that should have been supporting me through my retirement years. But the scope of Arthur's deception went far beyond the stolen pension payments. When the bank pulled the records for the fraudulent account redirect, they discovered that similar changes had been made to my Social Security direct deposit just 2 months after the pension theft began. My Social Security payments, totaling $1,447 per month, had also been redirected to Arthur's account starting in March 2021. The total theft was staggering: $55,511 in combined pension and Social Security payments over 13 months. While I had been struggling to pay for groceries and medications, skipping meals and rationing heating oil, Arthur had been depositing my entire retirement income into his personal account and using it to fund his comfortable suburban lifestyle. The forged documents were sophisticated enough to fool institutional review processes. But when fraud investigators showed them to me, the deception was obvious. The signature on the power of attorney authorization wasn't even close to my actual handwriting. The notarization had been performed by someone named Roger Roberts at a notary service in downtown Cleveland, a business I had never visited, located in a part of the city I rarely went to. Charles Dixon walked me through the timeline of Arthur's scheme with clinical precision that made each revelation more devastating than the last. The initial pension redirect had been established in January 2021, just 2 weeks after I'd mentioned to Arthur during a family dinner that I was proud of how well my retirement budget was working out. The Social Security redirect had followed. Soon after, implemented during the same period when Arthur was visiting more frequently and expressing such helpful concern about my delayed pension payments. The cash payments Arthur had been giving me, those generous gestures I'd been so grateful for, represented a tiny fraction of the money he was stealing from me each month. While depositing $4,247 of my retirement income into his account, he'd been handing me $40 or $60 in cash and presenting himself as a caring son helping his struggling mother through temporary financial difficulties. The pattern is unfortunately common in family financial abuse cases, Charles explained. The perpetrator redirects the victim's income to their own accounts, then provides small amounts of cash back to the victim to maintain the illusion of concern and prevent immediate suspicion. It's a way of stealing the majority of someone's money while appearing generous and helpful. As the investigation continued, more details of Arthur's deception emerged. He had been making regular transfers from the account receiving my retirement, payments to his primary checking account, mixing my stolen money with his legitimate income to obscure the theft. Bank records showed that the timing of these transfers often coincided with major purchases. The new SUV he'd bought in October, jewelry purchases that likely explained Violet's new accessories, and substantial payments to what appeared to be gambling websites. The gambling discovery was perhaps the most shocking revelation of all. Arthur wasn't just stealing my retirement income to maintain his lifestyle. He was apparently feeding a gambling addiction that had been consuming thousands of dollars per month. My pension and Social Security payments, the money I'd counted on for my basic survival, were being lost at online casinos and sports betting sites, while I rationed groceries and skipped medications. When Charles finished explaining the scope of Arthur's theft, I sat in stunned silence for several minutes, trying to process the complete destruction of everything I'd believed about my son and our relationship. The caring, concerned man who had been helping me navigate my pension crisis was actually the architect of that crisis. The son I'd been so grateful to have supporting me through financial difficulties was the person who had created those difficulties by stealing my entire retirement income. The most devastating realization was how perfectly Arthur's performance had been calibrated to maintain my trust while systematically robbing me. His expressions of concern about my struggling finances, his offers to help manage my money, his warnings about my deteriorating judgment, All of it had been designed to cover up his theft while positioning himself to gain even greater control over my remaining assets. "Mrs. Bennett," Charles said gently, "I know this is overwhelming, but we need to discuss next steps. This is clearly criminal fraud, and you'll need to decide whether you want to pursue prosecution. We also need to immediately freeze the accounts involved and begin the process of recovering your stolen funds." As I nodded numbly, agreeing to whatever steps were necessary, I felt something fundamental break inside me. Not just my trust in Arthur, but my understanding of who I was and what my life had been built on. The loving mother-son relationship I'd been so proud of, the family bonds I'd believed were unbreakable, the security I'd thought my decades of hard work had earned. All of it had been an illusion, maintained by a man who saw me not as his mother deserving love and respect, but as a source of income to be exploited. The boy I'd raised alone, sacrificed for, and loved unconditionally, had grown into someone capable of watching me suffer while stealing the money that could have alleviated that suffering. As I signed the documents to begin fraud proceedings against my own son, I realized that my life as Ruby Bennett, loving mother and proud grandmother, was over. What would emerge from this devastation remained to be seen. The moment I signed those fraud investigation documents at First National Bank, I felt a strange transformation begin within me. The crushing weight of betrayal that had pressed down on my chest for the past 48 hours began to shift into something harder and more focused. Rage, yes, but also a crystalline clarity that I hadn't experienced in decades. Ruby Bennett, the trusting mother who had spent 75 years putting everyone else's needs before her own, was gone. In her place stood a woman who would not be anyone's victim, not even her own son's. Charles Dixon had given me a business card for Detective George Holmes at the Cleveland Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, along with stern advice about the importance of acting quickly to preserve evidence and prevent Arthur from potentially destroying records or moving assets. As I walked out of the bank that afternoon, I felt the weight of that card in my purse like a loaded weapon. But before I could bring myself to involve law enforcement, I needed to understand the full scope of what Arthur had done to me. The banking records had revealed the financial theft, but I suspected there were other layers of deception that hadn't yet been uncovered. I spent that evening going through every document in my apartment, every conversation I could remember, every detail of Arthur's behavior over the past year that had seemed caring but now appeared sinister in light of what I'd learned. The power of attorney document that had been used to redirect my pension payments was particularly troubling. According to the fraud investigator, it had been notarized by Roger Roberts at a service called Downtown Legal Documents. The next morning, I took a bus to the address listed on the document, determined to find out how Arthur had obtained official notarization for my forged signature. Downtown Legal Documents occupied a cramped office in a rundown building near Cleveland's government district. Roger Roberts turned out to be a thin, nervous man in his 50s who seemed genuinely disturbed when I explained why I was there. "I remember that transaction," he said after examining the power of attorney document. "Your son brought you in, back in December 2020. You seemed a little confused, but he explained that you were having some memory issues, and that's why he was helping you with your paperwork." The lie was breathtaking in its audacity. Arthur hadn't forged my signature. He'd brought an imposter to the notary's office, someone who had pretended to be me while signing documents that would give him control over my retirement income. "Mr. Roberts," I said carefully, "I've never been in this office before in my life. I've never met you, and I certainly never signed any power of attorney documents. The woman who came here with my son was not me." Roger's face went pale as the implications sank in. "Oh my God," he whispered. "I've been wondering about that transaction for months." The woman seemed nervous, and she looked younger than the age listed on the ID she showed me. "But your son was so professional, so convincing about her condition." We spent the next hour reconstructing what had happened. Arthur had brought a woman claiming to be his mother to establish power of attorney over Ruby Bennett's finances. The imposter had been coached well enough to answer basic questions about my personal history, and Arthur had smoothly handled any moments when her knowledge seemed incomplete by referencing my supposed memory issues. Roger Roberts was clearly shaken by his unwitting participation in the fraud. He immediately provided me with copies of all documentation from the transaction and promised to cooperate fully with any law enforcement investigation. More importantly, he was able to describe the woman who had impersonated me, a detail that would prove crucial in understanding the full scope of Arthur's criminal conspiracy. Armed with this additional evidence of premeditated fraud, I finally felt ready to contact Detective George Holmes. The call was brief but decisive. Detective Holmes specializes in financial crimes against seniors, and he'd seen enough cases like mine to understand immediately that this wasn't a simple family misunderstanding but a sophisticated criminal operation. "Mrs. Bennett," he said after I'd outlined the basic facts, "what you're describing is elder financial abuse on a significant scale. The use of an imposter to establish fraudulent power of attorney elevates this to identity theft and potentially organized fraud. Can you come to the station this afternoon to file a formal complaint?" Sitting in Detective Holmes's office 2 hours later, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced since my working days at the textile factory. This wasn't just about recovering my stolen money, it was about ensuring that Arthur faced consequences for what he'd done and preventing him from victimizing others. Detective Holmes was a methodical man who took detailed notes and asked probing questions that revealed just how carefully Arthur had planned his theft. The timeline suggests this wasn't an impulsive crime, Detective Holmes observed after reviewing my documentation. "Your son spent months laying groundwork, recruiting an accomplice to impersonate you, and establishing systems to redirect your income. This level of premeditation will be important when we discuss charges with the district attorney." The detective explained that my case would likely result in felony charges including elder abuse, identity theft, and fraud. Because the total amount stolen exceeded $50,000, Arthur could face significant prison time if convicted. The use of an accomplice and forged documents would likely result in additional charges that could substantially increase any potential sentence. "I need to ask," Detective Holmes said, his voice gentle but direct. "Are you prepared for the consequences of pursuing criminal charges against your son? This will likely mean arrest, prosecution, and potentially years in prison. It will also become public record and could affect his employment and family relationships." The question hung in the air between us. Was I prepared to destroy my son's life to seek justice for what he'd done to mine? Was pursuing criminal charges an act of appropriate accountability or devastating revenge? I thought about Arthur's comfortable, suburban lifestyle, funded by my stolen retirement income. I thought about his new SUV, purchased while I was skipping meals to save money. I thought about Violet's jewelry and the children's expensive clothes, all bought with money stolen from their grandmother. I thought about watching me suffer while pretending to be concerned about my welfare. Most of all, I thought about the woman who had impersonated me at the notary's office. Arthur hadn't just stolen from me. He'd recruited someone else to participate in defrauding his own mother. This wasn't a moment of weakness or poor judgment. It was a calculated criminal enterprise. "Detective Holmes," I said firmly, "my son made his choices when he decided to steal my retirement income. I'm making mine now. I want to pursue every possible charge against him." The detective nodded and pulled out a fresh set of forms. "Then, let's get started. But Mrs. Bennett, I want you to prepare yourself for what comes next. Filing criminal charges against a family member is emotionally difficult, even when they've committed serious crimes. Do you have a support system to help you through this process?" The question made me realize how completely Arthur's betrayal had isolated me. Who could I turn to for support when the person I'd relied on most was the one who had betrayed me? My sisters lived far away and had their own health and family concerns. My few remaining friends in Cleveland were acquaintances rather than close. confidants. But then I remembered Frank Reynolds, my former supervisor at Patterson Textiles, who had always treated me with respect and kindness. Frank had retired 5 years earlier and moved to a small house near Lake Erie with his wife Patricia. We'd exchanged Christmas cards and occasional phone calls, but I'd been too proud to share my financial struggles with him during the pension crisis. Now, faced with the prospect of navigating a criminal investigation and prosecution without family support, I realized that Frank might be the ally I needed. He knew me well enough to understand my character, and he had enough experience with corporate fraud cases to appreciate the seriousness of what Arthur had done. As I walked out of the police station that afternoon with a case number and Detective Holmes's business card, I felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year: control over my own circumstances. For 13 months, I'd been reacting to crises created by Arthur's theft, accepting explanations that seemed reasonable, trusting someone who was systematically robbing me. Now I was taking action based on facts rather than faith, making decisions designed to protect my interests rather than preserve relationships that had proven to be illusions. It was terrifying and empowering in equal measure, but for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was fighting back rather than just surviving. The Ruby Bennett who had trusted blindly and sacrificed endlessly was gone. In her place stood a woman who would demand justice, accountability, and the respect she should have been receiving all along. Arthur was about to learn that his elderly mother was far more formidable than he'd calculated. The war against Arthur began, in earnest, the morning after I filed criminal charges. Detective Holmes had warned me that family financial abuse cases often escalate dramatically once the perpetrator realizes they've been discovered. And Arthur's reaction exceeded even the detective's experienced expectations for desperation and manipulation. I was awakened at 6:30 a.m. by pounding on my apartment door so violent that my elderly neighbor, Daisy Clark, later told me she'd considered calling the police before she heard Arthur's voice shouting through the hallway. When I looked through the peephole, I saw my son's face contorted with rage and panic, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled as if he'd dressed hastily and driven straight to my apartment without sleep. "Mom, open this door right now," he demanded, his voice carrying a threatening edge I'd never heard before. "We need to talk about this insane mistake you've made." I kept the security chain engaged as I opened the door just wide enough to speak to him. "Arthur, you need to leave. My property immediately. I have nothing to say to you." "Nothing to say?" His laugh was harsh and bitter. "You filed criminal charges against your own son based on some banking error, and you have nothing to say? Do you have any idea what you've done to my life? To Violet's life? To your grandchildren's lives?" The audacity of his victim narrative was breathtaking. After stealing over $55,000 of my retirement income, Arthur was presenting himself as the injured party, wrongfully accused by a confused elderly woman who didn't understand complex financial situations. "I know exactly what I've done," I replied, calmly. "I've reported the theft of my pension and Social Security payments to the appropriate authorities. Now leave, or I'll call the police to remove you." Arthur's demeanor shifted abruptly from angry to pleading, his voice taking on the manipulative tone he'd perfected during our monthly conversations about my delayed pension payments. "Mom, please, you have to listen to me. There's been a terrible misunderstanding. I was trying to help you, trying to protect your money during a complicated pension crisis. I never meant for you to feel like I was stealing from you. Let me explain what really happened." But I'd spent too many months listening to Arthur's explanations, accepting his versions of reality even when they contradicted my own observations. The woman who had trusted his every word was gone, replaced by someone who understood that every expression of concern, every helpful gesture, every loving comment had been part of an elaborate performance designed to cover up systematic theft. "Arthur," I said firmly, "the bank records show that you redirected my pension and Social Security payments to your personal account using forged documents. You brought an imposter to a notary's office to establish fraudulent power of attorney. You've been stealing my retirement income for over a year while watching me struggle to buy groceries. There's no misunderstanding. There's only theft. His face cycled through several emotions: shock that I knew specific details of his fraud, anger that his manipulation was no longer working, and finally a cold calculation that frightened me more than his rage had. "Fine," he said quietly. "You want to play hardball? Let's see how that works out for you. I've been taking care of you, supporting you, making sure you had enough money to live on. Without me, you're just a confused old woman living alone in a rundown apartment with no family support and no financial resources." The threat was clear: cooperate with Arthur's version of events or face complete isolation and abandonment. It was emotional blackmail designed to exploit my deepest fears about aging alone and dying forgotten. "I'd rather be alone than continue being stolen from by my own son," I replied, and closed the door in his face. Arthur's banging resumed for several more minutes before footsteps in the hallway indicated he'd finally left. But his departure didn't bring relief. It brought the realization that this confrontation was only the beginning of what would become an all-out assault on my credibility, my competence, and my right to seek justice for what had been done to me. The first salvo came that afternoon in the form of a phone call from Violet, Arthur's wife, whose voice carried a tone of concerned sympathy that I immediately recognized as Arthur's coaching. "Ruby," she said, using the informal version of my name that she'd never used before, "Arthur told me about the confusion with your bank accounts. I'm so sorry you're going through this difficult time. Memory issues can be really frightening, especially when they involve financial matters." Memory issues. Arthur had apparently decided that my discovery of his theft was evidence of cognitive decline rather than investigative competence. "Violet, my memory is fine," I said coldly. "Your husband has been stealing my retirement income for over a year. The bank has documentation proving the fraud. This isn't confusion, it's crime." "Oh, Ruby." Violet's voice carried a tone of gentle pity that made my skin crawl. "I know this feels very real to you, but Arthur explained that you've been having trouble keeping track of your finances lately. He's been trying so hard to help you, and it breaks his heart that you've misunderstood his efforts as something sinister." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Violet alternating between expressions of concern for my mental state and subtle threats about the consequences of pursuing legal action against Arthur. She mentioned his stellar reputation at Morrison Insurance Company, his standing in their suburban community, and the devastating impact that criminal charges would have on Jasper and Iris. "Those poor children," she said with manufactured emotion. "How do you explain to an 8-year-old that his grandmother has accused his father of being a criminal? How do you rebuild trust in a family after that kind of destructive accusation?" The implication was clear. I was the one destroying the family by refusing to accept Arthur's theft quietly. I was the selfish grandmother prioritizing my own grievances over the well-being of innocent children. The campaign against my credibility escalated over the following days. Arthur had apparently contacted my few remaining friends and acquaintances in Cleveland, sharing his version of events and positioning himself as a devoted son struggling to care for a mother whose mental faculties were declining. Mrs. Elena Martinez, from my book club, called to express concern about rumors she'd heard regarding my financial confusion and my unfair accusations against poor Arthur. My former co-worker, Oscar Phillips, contacted me to suggest that I might benefit from speaking with a doctor about memory issues that were apparently causing me to misinterpret normal family financial assistance as theft. Most painful was a call from my sister Madeline in Phoenix, who had been contacted by Arthur with a heartbreaking story about my cognitive decline and my paranoid accusations against him. "Ruby, honey," Madeline said with the gentle voice she'd used when we were children, and I'd scraped my knee. "Arthur called me because he's worried about you. He says you're accusing him of stealing your pension money, but that doesn't sound like something our Arthur would do. He's always been such a good boy." "Madeline, he brought an imposter to a notary's office to forge power of attorney documents," I explained patiently. He redirected my pension and Social Security payments to his personal account. The police have bank records proving everything I'm telling you. But Arthur's version had already taken root. Madeline had known Arthur since he was a baby. She'd watched me raise him alone, had been proud of his achievements, had seen him as the success story that justified all my years of struggle and sacrifice. The idea that this accomplished, respectful man would steal from his own mother was simply incompatible with 30 years of family narrative. "Sweetie, maybe you should talk to a doctor about this," Madeline suggested. "Sometimes stress and worry can make us see problems that aren't really there. Arthur loves you so much. He would never hurt you." I realized that Arthur had been brilliant in his approach. By establishing himself over decades as the perfect son, the responsible family member, the one who always took care of his mother, he'd created a narrative so powerful that evidence of his crimes was being interpreted as proof of my mental decline rather than his criminal behavior. The psychological warfare intensified when Arthur began showing up at places where he knew. I'd be the grocery store, the library, the bus stop where I waited for transportation to my doctor's appointments. He never approached me directly, but his presence was clearly intended as intimidation, a reminder that he could monitor my movements and activities whenever he chose. During one particularly unsettling encounter at Schneider's Market, Arthur positioned himself in the checkout line directly behind me, close enough that I could hear him speaking to the cashier in a voice deliberately loud enough for me to overhear. "My poor mother," he said with performed sadness. "She's been struggling with some confusion lately, accusing family members of things that never happened. It's heartbreaking to watch someone you love lose their grip on reality." The cashier, a young woman named Flora Shaw, who had been ringing up my groceries for years, looked at me with new uncertainty, as if seeing me for the first time as a potentially unreliable elderly customer rather than the sharp, organized woman who always had exact change and never forgot items on her shopping list. This pattern repeated itself across my small social world. Arthur was systematically undermining my reputation and credibility, preparing the ground for a narrative in which any accusations I made against him would be dismissed as the confused ramblings of a woman whose mind was failing. But Arthur had underestimated the woman he was fighting. Every attempt to discredit me only strengthened my resolve to see him held accountable. Every friend who questioned my mental competence, every acquaintance who suggested I was confused, every family member who sided with Arthur only reinforced my determination to prove that Ruby Bennett was nobody's victim. Detective Holmes had warned me that the battle would be difficult, that Arthur would likely escalate his attempts to discredit me as the investigation progressed. But he'd also assured me that criminal cases weren't decided by family dynamics or community gossip. They were decided by evidence, documentation, and facts. I had the bank records. I had the forged documents. I had the testimony of the notary, who could identify the woman Arthur had brought to impersonate me. No amount of manipulation or character assassination could change the fundamental reality that Arthur had committed serious crimes against his own mother. The war was far from over, but I was no longer fighting alone. Detective Holmes, the fraud. Investigators at First National Bank and the district attorney's office were all building a case based on evidence rather than emotion. Arthur could tell whatever stories he wanted about my mental state. The facts would speak for themselves. 3 months after filing criminal charges against Arthur, I sat in Assistant District Attorney Kayla Bright's office reviewing the comprehensive case that law enforcement had built against my son. The conference room table was covered with bank records, forged documents, surveillance footage from the notary's office, and testimony from witnesses who had unknowingly participated in Arthur's fraud scheme. The evidence was so overwhelming that even Arthur's expensive defense attorney had begun discussions about a plea agreement. Detective Holmes had done exceptional work building the case. The investigation had uncovered details of Arthur's crime that went far beyond what I'd initially discovered. The woman who had impersonated me at the notary's office was identified as Cora Davies, a gambling associate of Arthur's who worked at a payday loan company and had experience with financial documentation. She had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges, providing detailed testimony about how Arthur had recruited her and coached her to pose as his mentally declining mother. "Mrs. Bennett," District Attorney Wright began, "I want you to understand the strength of the case we've developed. Your son is facing 7 felony charges, including elder financial abuse, identity theft, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The total amount of stolen funds exceeds $55,000, which places this in the most serious category of financial crimes. If convicted on all charges, he could face up to 12 years in prison." 12 years. Arthur was 39 years old. A conviction would essentially destroy his middle-aged life, his career, his marriage, his relationship with his children, his standing in the community he'd worked so hard to join. Part of me, the part that still remembered holding him as a baby and teaching him to ride a bicycle, felt a stab of anguish at the thought of such devastating consequences. But a larger part of me, the part that had been strengthened by months of fighting for justice, felt satisfied that the legal system was taking his crimes seriously. Arthur hadn't made a single mistake or shown a momentary lapse in judgment. He had orchestrated a sophisticated fraud scheme that required months of planning, multiple accomplices, and systematic deception designed to exploit his own mother's trust and vulnerability. "The restitution aspect is straightforward," DA Wright continued. "Mr. Bell will be required to return every stolen dollar plus interest and penalties. The bank has already begun the process of reversing the fraudulent account redirections, so your pension and Social Security payments should resume their normal deposits within the next 2 weeks." Detective Holmes leaned forward in his chair. "Mrs. Bennett, there's something else we discovered during the investigation that you should know about. Arthur's gambling problem was significantly worse than we initially understood. He wasn't just stealing your retirement income to enhance his lifestyle. He was using it to cover massive gambling debts." The detective slid a folder across the table containing printouts of Arthur's online gambling activity. The numbers were staggering. Over the 13 months that he'd been stealing my retirement income, Arthur had lost over $73,000 at online casinos and sports betting sites. My stolen pension and Social Security payments hadn't been funding a comfortable suburban lifestyle. They'd been feeding an addiction that was consuming money faster than Arthur could steal it. The gambling addiction explains why he was so desperate to gain control over your other assets, DA Wright observed. Bank records show he was falling behind on his mortgage payments and had maxed out several credit cards trying to cover his losses. Your retirement income was probably keeping him from complete financial collapse. This revelation reframed everything I'd understood about Arthur's motivations. He hadn't stolen from me out of greed or a sense of entitlement. He'd stolen from me because he was drowning in gambling debt and saw my retirement income as a lifeline. The expensive SUV, Violet's jewelry, the children's clothes, all of it had probably been purchased on credit that Arthur couldn't afford, creating an illusion of prosperity while his financial situation spiraled out of control. "What about Violet?" I asked. "Did she know about the gambling or the theft?" "Theft?" Detective Holmes shook his head. "Mrs. Bell appears to have been genuinely unaware of both the gambling addiction and the source of the money her husband was using to maintain their lifestyle. She's been cooperative with the investigation and has filed for divorce. She's also indicated that she wants to bring the children to see you once the criminal case is resolved." The thought of seeing Jasper and Iris again brought tears to my eyes. I'd missed them terribly during the months of legal proceedings, but I'd understood that any contact would be complicated by the charges against their father. Knowing that Violet wanted to preserve their relationship with their grandmother felt like a small miracle amid the wreckage of our family. "Now," DA Wright said, "we need to discuss Arthur's plea offer. His attorney has proposed that he plead guilty to 3 felony charges in exchange for a sentence of 4 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 2 years. He would also pay full restitution plus penalties, and he would be required to complete gambling addiction treatment." 4 years instead of 12. It was a significant reduction, but it would still mean Arthur would lose his career, his home, and several years of his life. More importantly for me, it would mean acknowledgement of guilt and guarantee of restitution without the emotional ordeal of a public trial. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "Honestly," DA Wright replied, "I think it's a reasonable offer. The evidence against him is overwhelming, so we'd likely win at trial anyway. But plea agreements save court resources and guarantee outcomes. 4 years is still a substantial sentence that reflects the seriousness of his crimes." I thought about everything Arthur had put me through, not just the financial theft, but the psychological manipulation, the attempts to discredit my mental competence, the campaign to turn family and friends against me. I thought about watching me struggle to buy groceries while depositing my stolen retirement income into his gambling accounts. But I also thought about Jasper and Iris, who would grow up with a father in prison regardless of whether he served 4 years or 12. I thought about the gambling addiction that had apparently driven Arthur to commit crimes he might never have considered otherwise. And I thought about my own desire to move forward with my life rather than spend years relitigating this betrayal in courtrooms. "I'll accept the plea agreement," I said finally. "But I want to address him directly before he's sentenced. I want him to hear from me about what his actions cost." 3 weeks later, I stood in a Cleveland courtroom watching Arthur Bell, wearing an orange jail jumpsuit instead of his usual business suits, plead guilty to elder financial abuse, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. His voice was barely audible as he acknowledged each charge and confirmed his understanding of the 4-year prison sentence he was accepting. When Judge Larry Hayes asked if I wanted to make a victim impact statement, I stood and looked directly at my son for the first time since that morning when he'd pounded on my apartment door. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady and clear, "the man standing before you is my only son. I raised him alone after his father abandoned us. I worked double shifts for years to give him opportunities. I was proud of the man I thought he'd become." Arthur's head was bowed, but I could see tears on his cheeks. The financial theft was devastating, but it wasn't the worst part of what he did to me. The worst part was the lies, the manipulation, the systematic campaign to make me doubt my own competence and sanity. He watched me struggle to buy groceries with money he was stealing from me. He listened to me worry about paying bills while depositing my retirement income into his gambling accounts. I paused, gathering my thoughts for what I knew would be my final words to Arthur as his mother. I hope prison gives him time to understand what he's done and to get help for the addiction that drove him to commit these crimes. I hope he emerges from this experience as someone capable of honest relationships and genuine remorse. But I also want this court and everyone in this room to understand that crimes against elderly people are not victimless offenses. They destroy trust, dignity, and the security that people work their entire lives to build. Judge Hayes nodded solemnly before pronouncing Arthur's sentence: 4 years in state prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation, complete restitution of $57,147 including interest and penalties, and mandatory participation in gambling, addiction treatment programs. As Arthur was led away in handcuffs, he turned to look at me one final time. Our eyes met across the courtroom, and for just a moment, I saw not the calculating criminal who had stolen my retirement income, but the little boy who had once promised that we'd always take care of each other. "I'm sorry, Mom," he mouthed silently. I nodded once, acknowledging his words without forgiving them, and walked out of the courtroom into the bright afternoon sun. Justice had been served, my financial security had been restored, and the legal battle was finally over. Now the real work could begin. Rebuilding a life based on truth rather than illusion, and discovering who Ruby Bennett could become when she was no longer defined by the people who had betrayed her trust. 2 years after Arthur's sentencing, I stood in the community center in Millbrook, my hometown, preparing to deliver a presentation that would have been unimaginable during my days as a trusting mother who believed family bonds were unbreakable. The room was filled with senior citizens, their adult children, and community leaders, all gathered to hear my story as part of a county-wide initiative to prevent elder financial abuse. "Good afternoon," I began, looking out at the attentive faces. "My name is Ruby Bennett, and I'm here to tell you about the day I discovered that my own son had been stealing my pension for over a year, and how that devastating betrayal ultimately became the catalyst for the most empowering chapter of my life." The transformation hadn't happened overnight. In the months immediately following Arthur's conviction, I'd struggled with profound loneliness and a crisis of identity that threatened to consume me. The mother-son relationship that had defined my adult life was gone, destroyed by crimes that couldn't be forgiven even if they could be understood. The family narrative I'd been so proud of, the single mother who'd successfully raised an accomplished, caring son, had been revealed as an elaborate fiction. But gradually, with the help of unexpected allies and my own rediscovered strength, I'd begun to build something entirely new from the wreckage of what had been stolen from me. The financial recovery had been the easiest part. My pension and Social Security payments had resumed their normal deposits within weeks of Arthur's guilty plea, and the restitution payments from his assets had restored most of what he'd stolen. But more importantly, Detective Holmes had connected me with a victims' rights organization that helped me understand my experience wasn't unique or shameful. It was part of a broader pattern of elder financial abuse that affected hundreds of thousands of families each year. Financial exploitation by family members accounts for over 60% of elder abuse cases, I told my audience, sharing statistics that had once shocked me, but now felt like crucial information that could protect others. The average victim loses over $120,000, and many never report the crimes because they feel too embarrassed or because they want to protect their families from consequences. Working with the Victims' Rights Organization had introduced me to other survivors of family financial abuse. Women and men who discovered that children, spouses, or siblings had been systematically stealing from them while maintaining facades of love and concern. These connections had been revelatory, not just because they proved I wasn't alone, but because they showed me what recovery and empowerment could look like. Eleanor Shaw, a 78-year-old woman whose daughter had stolen over $200,000 from her retirement accounts, had become both a mentor and close friend. Eleanor had channeled her experience into advocacy work, speaking at community centers and senior living facilities about the warning signs of financial abuse and the importance of maintaining control over one's assets regardless of age. "The most important thing I learned," Eleanor had told me during one of our early conversations, "is that being victimized doesn't make you a victim. How you respond to what happened to you, that's what defines who you are." Following Eleanor's example, I'd begun volunteering with the Victims' Rights Organization, initially helping other survivors navigate the legal system and gradually expanding into education and prevention work. The presentations I gave at community centers, churches, and senior living facilities weren't just about sharing my story. They were about empowering older adults to maintain their autonomy and protect themselves from financial predators, even when those predators were members of their own families. The hardest lesson for many of us to learn, I continued my presentation, is that age doesn't make us less capable of managing our own affairs. Financial abusers count on us believing that getting older means we need to be taken care of, that we should be grateful when family members offer to help with our finances, even when that help involves taking control away from us. The educational work had given my retirement a purpose I'd never imagined possible. Instead of the quiet, family-centered golden years I'd originally planned, I was traveling throughout Ohio and neighboring states, speaking to audiences about financial literacy, legal rights, and the importance of maintaining independence as we age. The Ohio Attorney General's office had even hired me as a consultant on their elder abuse prevention initiatives, work that felt meaningful in ways my decades at the textile factory never had. My personal relationships had been rebuilt on entirely new foundations. The connection with my sister Madeline in Phoenix had been restored after she'd seen news coverage of Arthur's conviction and realized the truth of what I'd tried to tell her. Madeline had flown to Cleveland to apologize in person, and we'd spent weeks rebuilding trust through honest conversations about family dynamics and the warning signs we'd both missed. "I should have listened to you instead of protecting the image I had of Arthur," Madeline had told me through tears. "I should have trusted your judgment instead of assuming you were confused." Most surprisingly, I'd developed an unexpected friendship with Frank Reynolds, my former supervisor at Patterson Textiles, who had reached out after hearing about the criminal case. Frank and his wife Patricia had become regular fixtures in my new life, providing both emotional support and practical assistance as I'd navigated the legal proceedings and rebuilt my social connections. "You know," Frank had told me recently, over coffee, "you're more confident and assertive now than you ever were during all those years we worked together. It's like discovering your own power changed everything about how you move through the world." He was right. The Ruby Bennett who had trusted blindly and sacrificed endlessly was gone, replaced by a woman who asked questions, demanded transparency, and refused to accept explanations that didn't align with observable facts. I'd learned to trust my own judgment over other people's reassurances, to value my own needs as highly as anyone else's, and to understand that maintaining relationships built on lies and manipulation wasn't worth the emotional cost. The relationship with my grandchildren had been carefully restored through supervised visits arranged by Violet, who had indeed filed for divorce and was working to rebuild her own life after discovering the extent of Arthur's deception. 8-year-old Jasper and 7-year-old Iris didn't fully understand why their father was in prison, but they'd accepted that Grandma Ruby was back in their lives and seemed genuinely happy to reconnect with me. "Grandma," Iris had asked during one recent visit, "why do people take money that doesn't belong to them?" It was a question that had required careful consideration of how much truth a 7-year-old could handle. But it had also been an opportunity to teach about honesty, consequences, and the importance of treating others with respect regardless of their age or relationship to you. "Sometimes people make very bad choices when they're scared or sick," I'd told her. "But that doesn't make their choices okay, and it doesn't mean the people they hurt should accept being treated badly." As I concluded my presentation at the Millbrook Community Center, I looked out at an audience that included several women who reminded me of myself 2 years earlier. Trusting, family-oriented seniors who couldn't imagine that their own children might exploit their love and vulnerability. "The most important thing I want you to remember," I said, "is that your age doesn't diminish your right to control your own life and resources. Being someone's mother, father, grandmother, or grandfather doesn't make you less capable of making decisions about your own money. And if someone, anyone, even family, tries to convince you otherwise, that's when you need to start asking hard questions and demanding clear answers." After the presentation, several audience members approached me with their own concerns about family members who'd been showing unusual interest in their finances. An elderly man named Gabriel Nelson described how his son had been pressuring him to add his name to bank accounts for convenience. A woman named Alice Parker shared that her daughter-in-law had been suggesting she was becoming too forgetful to handle her own bill paying. Each conversation reminded me why this work mattered. Financial abuse thrived in secrecy and shame, in the assumption that family relationships were inherently trustworthy and that questioning them was disloyal or paranoid. By sharing my story publicly, by refusing to protect Arthur's reputation at the expense of truth, I was helping others recognize warning signs before they became victims. That evening, I returned to my apartment, the same apartment Arthur had tried to convince me I was too old and confused to maintain independently, and settled into my chair with a cup of tea and the evening news. My pension and Social Security deposits arrived reliably each month. My bills were paid on time by my own careful management. My savings account was growing steadily without anyone else's help or oversight. At 77, I was living exactly the life I'd worked 43 years to earn. Financially secure, socially connected, and purposefully engaged with my community. The difference was that this life was built on truth rather than illusion, on my own strength rather than dependence on others, on relationships that honored my autonomy rather than exploiting my trust. Arthur would be eligible for parole in 18 months. I'd received one letter from him since his conviction, a carefully worded apology that acknowledged his crimes and expressed hope for eventual reconciliation. I'd read it once and filed it away without responding. Whether we would ever have contact again remained an open question, one I would answer based on my own needs rather than family obligation or social pressure. The Ruby Bennett, who might have felt guilty for refusing to forgive, who might have worried about appearing unchristian or unmaternal, was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that forgiveness was a gift to be given freely, not an obligation to be extracted through manipulation or guilt. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this unexpected chapter of my life. Arthur's betrayal had destroyed the family narrative I'd cherished, but it had also freed me to discover who I could become when I was no longer defined by other people's needs and expectations. I'd learned that being someone's victim was a temporary condition, but being a survivor was a choice that could transform not just your own life, but the lives of others who needed to hear that recovery and empowerment were possible even after the most devastating betrayals. The boy I'd raised was serving time in prison for stealing from his mother, but the woman he'd tried to victimize had emerged stronger, more confident, and more purposeful than she'd ever been. In the end, that might be the most fitting justice of all. 5 years after that certified letter from First National Bank changed my life forever, I sat in the visiting room at Mansfield Correctional Institution, waiting to see Arthur for the first time since his sentencing. He'd been released on parole 3 months earlier, and had written asking if we could meet, not at my apartment or his halfway house, but at the prison where he'd served his time, a symbolic choice that I appreciated for its honesty about where our relationship stood. Arthur appeared through the secured door looking older than his 44 years, thinner than I remembered, wearing the kind of humble expression that came from genuine humility rather than calculated manipulation. Prison had stripped away the polished veneer of the successful insurance executive, revealing someone I barely recognized but somehow trusted more than the son I'd raised. "Mom," he said quietly, taking the seat across from me but not attempting any physical contact. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't sure you would." "I wasn't sure I would either," I replied honestly. "But your letter sounded different from the others. More real." We sat in awkward silence for several minutes, both of us aware that this conversation would determine whether any relationship between us was possible going forward. Arthur looked around the visiting room where he'd spent countless hours over the past 4 years, then back at me with eyes that held genuine remorse rather than self-pity. "I want you to know," he began carefully, "that I understand now what I did to you wasn't just theft. It was a complete betrayal of everything you taught me about treating people with respect and dignity. I stole your money, yes, but I also stole your peace of mind, your trust in your own judgment, and your confidence in family relationships." The words sounded rehearsed, but his delivery felt authentic in ways his previous apologies hadn't. "The gambling addiction doesn't excuse what I did," he continued. "Plenty of people struggle with addiction without stealing from their own mothers. I made a choice to solve my problems by exploiting someone who loved me unconditionally." I studied his face, looking for signs of the manipulation I'd learned to recognize, but found only exhaustion and what appeared to be genuine accountability. "What's different now?" I asked. Arthur smiled ruefully. "Prison, mostly. 4 years of having absolutely no control over anything, of living with the consequences of my choices every single day. I went through 18 months of addiction counseling, not because it might reduce my sentence, but because I finally understood that my gambling wasn't just hurting me. It was turning me into someone capable of watching my own mother suffer while I robbed her. He pulled out a small notebook, worn from handling. I wrote you a letter every week for 4 years. I never sent them, but I wrote them, trying to understand how I'd become someone who could do what I did to you. The counselor said it was part of accountability, facing the full scope of the harm I'd caused rather than just focusing on my own problems. The notebook represented more introspection than Arthur had ever demonstrated during our monthly conversations about my delayed pension payments. The hardest part, he said, was accepting that you might never forgive me, and that would be completely fair. I spent so much time expecting forgiveness as a right, rather than understanding it as a gift that might never come. Forgiveness and relationship are different things, I said. I've forgiven you, Arthur, because carrying anger was hurting me more than it was hurting you. But forgiveness doesn't automatically restore trust or relationship. Arthur nodded. I know. Violet explained that to me before she stopped bringing the kids for visits. She said forgiveness is about healing yourself, but trust has to be earned through consistent behavior over time. The mention of Violet and the children brought a familiar pang. Violet had remarried 2 years earlier to a man named Felix Cook, who worked as a teacher and seemed genuinely devoted to Jasper and Iris. The children visited me regularly now, but they called Felix Dad and referred to Arthur as our father who made mistakes. It was a healthier arrangement than I'd initially imagined possible. I know you've been working with other families, Arthur said. Violet told me about the presentations you give, the advocacy work. I'm proud of you for turning what I did into something that helps other people. The comment struck me as genuine, without the undertone of manipulation that had characterized so many of our past conversations. It's given my retirement meaning I never expected, I admitted. Helping other people recognize warning signs and protect themselves feels more important than anything else I've done. I want you to know, Arthur said, that part of my parole conditions include continued counseling and financial oversight. I'm working at a warehouse now, making enough to cover my basic expenses and the restitution payments. I live in a 1-bedroom apartment and take the bus to work. I don't have access to credit cards or online gambling sites. He looked directly at me for the first time during our conversation. I'm not asking to be welcomed back into your life, Mom. I'm just asking you to know that I'm committed to becoming someone worthy of the sacrifice you made raising me alone. Maybe someday I'll be someone you can be proud of again. The conversation lasted another hour, covering practical matters like his job prospects, his relationship with his addiction, and his hopes for eventually rebuilding some connection with Jasper and Iris when they were old enough to understand the full story of what had happened. When visiting time ended, we stood and looked at each other across a gulf that might never be fully bridged. Can I hug you? Arthur asked hesitantly. I nodded, and for just a moment, I held my son the way I had when he was young and afraid, when the world seemed too big and uncertain for his small shoulders to bear. He felt fragile in my arms, diminished by his experiences, but perhaps more genuinely human than he'd been in years. I love you, Mom, he whispered. I never stopped loving you, even when I was doing terrible things to you. I love you too, I replied, and meant it. But love isn't enough to build a relationship on. You understand that now, don't you? I do, he said. If we ever have a relationship again, it'll have to be built on honesty and respect, not just family obligation. As I drove home from the prison that afternoon, I reflected on how different this conversation had been from the Arthur I remembered. Prison had broken him down in ways that seemed genuinely reconstructive rather than merely punitive. Whether this humility and self-awareness would translate into lasting change remained to be seen. But for the first time since his arrest, I felt cautiously hopeful that my son might eventually become someone worth knowing. That evening, I received a call from Eleanor Shaw, my mentor in the victim advocacy work, who wanted to discuss a speaking engagement we'd been invited to do together at a national conference on elder abuse prevention. Eleanor was now 83, still sharp and passionate about protecting seniors from financial exploitation. "Ruby," she said, "I've been thinking about something. We've been focusing on prevention and recognition of abuse, but maybe it's time. We started talking more about recovery and rebuilding. You're living proof that being victimized doesn't have to define the rest of someone's life." She was right. My story had become more than just a cautionary tale about family financial abuse. It had become a testament to the possibility of rebuilding life after devastating betrayal. At 77, I was more financially secure, socially connected, and purposefully engaged than I'd been at any point since Harold left when Arthur was 12. The apartment I'd been told I was too old to maintain independently was still my sanctuary, but it was also my office for advocacy work, my meeting place for the book club I'd started for senior women, and my haven for visits with Jasper and Iris. The woman who'd once defined herself primarily through her role as Arthur's mother had discovered she was also Ruby Bennett, advocate, educator, and survivor. 6 months later, I received another letter from Arthur. This one was different, shorter, less focused on his remorse, and more focused on his actions. He'd completed his GED instructor certification and was volunteering to teach literacy classes at a community center. He'd been attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings for 2 years and had become a sponsor for other people struggling with addiction. He'd started a small savings account and was making his restitution payments ahead of schedule. "I'm not writing to ask for anything," the letter concluded. "I just wanted you to know that I'm trying to become someone who makes the world a little better instead of someone who takes from it. Maybe someday you'll be willing to meet for coffee and hear about the man I'm trying to become." I folded the letter and put it in the box where I kept correspondence related to my advocacy work. Arthur's journey toward redemption was his own responsibility, not mine. Whether it would eventually intersect with my life in meaningful ways remained an open question, one I would answer based on evidence rather than hope, on consistency rather than promises. The Ruby Bennett who had trusted blindly was gone forever. But the Ruby Bennett who had emerged from betrayal and chosen empowerment over victimhood was just beginning to understand what the rest of her life might become. At 77, with my pension secure, my independence intact, and my purpose clear, I was finally living the retirement I'd earned, one built on truth, strength, and the hard-won wisdom that comes from refusing to let anyone else's choices define your own worth. The boy I'd raised had become a man who'd stolen from his mother, but the woman he'd tried to destroy had become someone who could help others protect themselves from similar betrayals. In the end, that transformation felt like the most complete justice possible. Not just accountability for past crimes, but protection for future victims. And perhaps, someday, the possibility of redemption for those willing to earn it through years of consistent change rather than moments of convenient apology. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.